Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this meeting of the Agricultural and Seasonal Workforce Services Advisory Committee. My name is Dan Zeitlin, and I'm the Policy Director at the Employment Security Department. We are recording this meeting. By your continued participation in the meeting, you are consenting to being recorded. I'm going to turn things over to our Executive Assistant, Tamara Johnson, to call roll for the meeting. Tamara?
Good morning, everyone. Let's start with John Devaney this morning.
Present. Good morning.
Good morning, John. And Mike Gempler. Delia Pena. Victoria Rudy.
Good morning.
Good morning, Victoria. Edgar Franks.
Here.
Hi, Edgar. Michelle Besso.
Good morning.
Good morning, Michelle.
Hi.
Rosalinda Guillen.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, Rosalinda. Jeff Peralt.
Morning. I'm here.
Good morning, Jeff. Ignacio let us know he will not be here today. Todd Phillips.
I'm here, and I'll end up being out from 9 to 10:30 this morning.
Okay, thanks for letting us know.
Thanks.
Uriel Inguez.
Good morning.
Good morning. Dan, I know you are here. And Bertha, I know you are here because I've heard you already. Gustavo Aviles.
Good morning, everyone. Here.
Good morning. Craig Carroll is out. Alberto Iziordia. I know he was having connectivity issues, so he might not be on yet. Renee Maldonado.
Here.
Juan Martinez.
Good morning. Here.
Good morning, Juan. Ana Alcala Rodriguez.
Hi, good morning. I'm here.
Good morning, Anna. Petra Moraz.
Good morning. I'm here.
Good morning, Petra. And Vicki Carlson.
Good morning.
And so going back, how about Mike Gempler? Have you joined? Or Delia Pena? Okay, I'll turn it back over to you, Dan. And we do have a quorum.
Thank you, Tamara, and welcome again, everybody. Tamara, can you please pull up the agenda for the meeting? I'll start by going through that. All right, so our first order of business for the day will be to review and potentially approve the meeting minutes from our last meeting, which occurred on March 17th. We'll then move to our typical ASWS office update, led by Bertha Clayton, along with Petra Moraz. We'll talk about foreign labor certification applications, staffing in the ASWS office, and compliance issues. Following that discussion, we're going to move to discuss a couple of the recommendations from the 2020 report. We're going to start by talking about the waiver we're planning to submit to the Department of Labor. Gary Kamamura, our workforce policy manager, will lead that. And then Gustavo Aviles has an update on the customer experience study. We have a request from some committee members to discuss adverse weather impacts. That is some unseasonable weather we've had in parts of Washington, potential impacts on crops, and then potential impacts on the workforce. Following that discussion, we'll take a break. We're then going to turn to the 2022 report. Bertha's going to quickly touch on the timeline we have, just to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of how we're proceeding with that report. And then I'll provide an overview of the budget, looking back at information we provided in the 2020 report and how federal and state funding resources have or have not changed in the interim, and take questions and plan for that section of the report. We'll have a closing discussion, in which will entertain any items that voting members would like to have on the agenda at the next meeting. And at the end of this meeting, there will be an opportunity for anybody from the public who wishes to comment for up to 2 minutes. Any questions about today's agenda? All right, hearing none. Voting members of the committee received the meeting minutes from our March 17th meeting. Happy to give everyone time to do any further review, take any questions, and entertain any motions to approve.
I move we approve.
All right, thank you, Rosalinda. We have a motion to approve the minutes from Rosalinda Guillen. Do we have a second?
This is Jeff. I second.
All right, thank you, Jeff. Motion to approve from Rosalinda, second from Jeff Brault. Anybody object to approving the meeting minutes? All right, those minutes are approved. Thank you, Rosalinda and Jeff. And with that, let me turn things over to Bertha, who will provide an update on the ASWS office and activities. Bertha.
Good morning, everybody. And I think that Petra is going to provide her FLC update first. So I'm going to turn it over to her, and you'll hear from me in a moment.
Thank you, Bertha, and good morning again, everyone. Today, my name is Petra Meraz. Today, I will be reporting out on the H-2A program. As of to date, we have received and processed 302 applications for total workers requested 29,181. Last year, this same time, we received 252 applications, total workers requested 23,077. Applications that have been withdrawn or not processed by DOL are 15 for this year, with a total requested of 2,273. Last year, we had 9, with total workers requested of 501. No contracts in possibilities yet. Total number of contracts commenced as of to date is 181. Total workers requested 13,838. Last year, we had 133 applications or contracts with a total workers requested of 10,291. And as of today, we have 174 active job orders with the workers total requested of 13,562. Last year, we had 130 applications active at this time last year with a total workers requested of 10,032. That is my report for today. Any questions?
Yes, thank you. This is John. I think it was last month I asked if we had any data on how many of these might be first time or new applicants, or if it was a change in timing or division of longer term contracts into multiple contracts, to get a sense of, are we seeing increased activity or just change of structure and pacing? Have you had a chance to review and see how many of these contract applications are first time users of the program?
Thank you. Yes, so this year, starting from October 1st to date, we have 20 new employers with a total requested of 818 workers for this year. Last year, this time we had 11 new employers. So this year, we've seen that most of the employers, actually, let me go back a little bit. So we count the withdrawn. Some employers are new, so they have to, either their application is incomplete or they have a lot of notice of deficiencies, that we suggest that they resubmit their application, because it's a lot of work for them and for us to to change a lot of the stuff. Some are very new to it, so to the program, so they don't know all the CFRs and the stuff that needs to be in an application. So with that, and so that's why they have to resubmit. So the applications are basically doubled, right? Like there's 15, they resubmitted, and at times there's been a few employers where they actually have to submit it more than twice because their application is still incompleted. If that answers your question.
I think so, yes. If we could include some of that information on an ongoing basis to get a sense of how much of this is growth, that would be really helpful because it is complicated. And I think sometimes the change of or resubmitted applications, as you described, could create a little confusion about what exactly we're looking at.
Okay, I will talk to Tamara and Bertha, and we will include a column or something with a little more detailed information for next time. Thank you.
Thank you, Petra. I did want to say I really like this chart, though. This is a lot easier to follow than just having it read to us each month. So thank you for preparing this for us.
Thank you.
And Petra, and this is Michelle. I'm sorry. I know you've said this before, but I just want to be sure that I understand. So the number of applications withdrawn, do we subtract that from the 302 to get the number of applications that have actually been processed and, that are not duplicative?
Correct. So the 302 is every application we get, regardless of if they were being withdrawn or not approved by us or not approved by DOL. Correct.
Okay.
So Petra, is there any way for us to get an idea of the new applicants, the new employers, what part of the state they're in?
As of right now, there's 20. I did not get the data of where they're all located in Washington, but I can definitely get that for next time. But they're all over. I can say that they're all over Washington, so I can get that information. I apologize for not having it.
Great, thank you. And I'm assuming we're going to get this information emailed to us, right? The panels.
I was going to say, Rosalind, I think what we can do is send information that we have. So that is the number of new contracts, where they're located in the state in the interim. So following this meeting, and then if there's other information in addition to that that you'd like to see presented, we can take that input in advance of the next meeting.
Thank you.
Petra, will you be talking about this graph?
Sure, I can talk about this graph. So as you can see, the graphic talks about the workers by applicant holding offices. So as of right now, the one that's leading is Okanogan. It has a workers requested of 5,540 workers, and then Yakima is to the second most workers requested in Washington.
Could you explain, maybe I'm forgetting, what does it mean, applicant holding office?
So it's the work source offices that create the job orders. Not all the work source offices in Washington create job orders for the ag. So in this, if you can see them, these are all the ones that are that have a business person that creates the job order for us. So once we get an application in flag, we request a job order number, and these are the offices that create it. So for example, if there's an application, I'm just going to use Columbia Basin, which is Kennewick, because I'm in this office. If there's a job order in Benton City or Pasco, they go to Kennewick, to Columbia Basin.
Oh, I see. So then it's reported under the Columbia Basin column.
Correct. And for example, Yakima or Sunnyside or Union Gap or wherever there's a job order in the Yakima County, it goes to Yakima, to that office, regardless if it's in Union Gap, like I mentioned, or or some other Moxie or some other city.
All right.
It's really interesting. I just see, I mean, Yakima is now almost as many as Okanagan. It just seems like for a long time, Yakima did not have that many H2A applications. I think because we do have quite a large local workforce in Yakima. And so it seemed like there was more use of the H2A program in Okanagan and in Columbia Basin. So it's just interesting to see the rise in Yakima.
Yeah. And it's one of the offices that has more counties. So that has something to do too, I guess. It's a bigger giving
Oh, does
count.
that include the Klickitat? No, that's Columbia Gorge. So which counties does Yakima include?
I don't have the list, but
Okay, never
I can
mind.
put it on the chat in just a few minutes.
Michelle,
Sorry
and
about that.
this is Bertha. I'm going to be showing a chart later on in my presentation that has our regions identified, and you'll be able to clearly see which counties are in the Yakima region.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Bertha. Any other questions, or we can move on with Bertha?
Okay, thank you, Petra. I'm Bertha Clayton. I am the ASWS director, and I'm going to be talking with you all today about office updates generally, and then also honing in on our compliance staff activity. So the first thing I want to do is I want to introduce you to Vicki Carlson. She is assisting Tamara in running today's meeting. She's our new administrative assistant. She's now occupying the position that Tamara occupied, since Tamara is now in our FLC unit. Vicki was hired on 4/1, and she has given me permission to share the following very brief bio about her. Vicki has extensive background in administration and database applications, and has recently started her state career as the administrative assistant of our ASWS unit. Vicki is excited to be a part of an organization that values innovation, collaboration, and service with kindness, and looks forward to being part of the collaborative process. So I just want to welcome Vicki. You're going to see her in correspondence, and likely going to be receiving correspondence primarily from her very soon. And we are very excited to have her on board. I think she's going to be a fantastic fit for our unit. And with Vicki's hire, all of our positions are now filled, and we are officially, I know we've been saying this, fully staffed, but because Tamara shifted to the FLC position, that opened her position up. And so with Vicki's hire, we are now completely staffed. Vicki, I want to give you the opportunity if you want to just introduce yourself really fast. I know we just spoke a little bit, but if you want to say something, and if not, that's okay too.
Thanks, Bertha. I appreciate it. My name is Vicki Carlson, and I appreciate the warm welcome, and I look forward to working with everybody. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for introducing yourself, Vicki. Welcome.
Welcome, Vicki. I may have missed it. What office are you working out of?
The Kennewick office.
Okay, thank you.
Great. So I want to move on now to a training update with regards to our compliance staff and our FLC team. Since our last meeting, each member of our compliance staff has completed the 2-day Washington State Investigator Training Core. It's a 2-day training that focuses on interviewing and researching competencies. All staff, as I said, completed this training. The feedback that I heard was that it was very beneficial. And so that's a big chunk of training that our staff had that I think is going to be really helpful in the work that we do. We also are focusing and training on uniformity. And I'm going to be speaking about this in a moment, but just to give you a preview, our goal as a compliance unit, we have obviously, as you know, 7 specialists across the state, is to provide a uniform site visit experience across regions and across specialists. This month, we received some very valuable feedback from one of our committee members, Delia Peña, which was very helpful in our recognition of areas that we can elevate. And so I'll be speaking about that in a moment in detail. With regards to our FLC team, we are in a bit of a, I don't want to say slow time, but we have survived our our first wave of the very busy season. And so we are leveraging this downtime, if you will, to explore some opportunities to improve our processing capacity. Specifically, we are exploring in-person opportunities at the Chicago National Processing Center, which, as you all know, is where the Department of Labor processes and certifies the ETA 790s. We haven't made a lot of headway yet in this because we haven't heard back from the Department of Labor about opportunities, but our goal is to send our whole staff to train under DOL certifying officers, with the goal of increasing our capability for application review and getting that direct instruction, which we feel is going to be very, very valuable. Before we move on to the next slide, any questions about training or our office in general? Great. Next slide, please. So I want to focus now on our compliance work, and just to set the table on this, as you all know, ASWS, we have our compliance unit of our 7 compliance specialists, and also our new compliance supervisor, Margarito Cabrera, in addition to our FLC team, and also the state monitor advocate is housed underneath our office too. But I want to present to you specifically about our compliance activity. And just to give you a reminder, as we talk about this terminology, our site visits, which, as you know, a couple of months ago, we rebranded, if you will. These are field visits, but we called them site visits to avoid confusion with field checks, which is a different animal. Site visits, they're prearranged to the work sites and or the housing. Our compliance specialists are verifying compliance with the terms and conditions of employment, informing workers of their rights, and also providing education and technical assistance to the employers. Site visits are an assurance that are agreed to by the employer upon placing a job order, and then they apply to all H-2A workers. And our goal as a team this year is to perform at least 1 site visit on 100% of H-2A job orders. So we want to visit everyone. And as you'll see in the next slide, we're off to a very good start. So Michelle, this is the map that I was referencing. The numbers are the different regions that are our compliance regions. Our total site visits are, as of 4/19/22, we've performed 110 site visits, and we've made contact with 5,150 farm workers. To your question, Michelle, the Yakima area includes the southwest Washington. You'll see the data further broken down by region. I'm going to give you a moment to review it, and please let me know if you have any questions.
Bertha, this is John. I've noticed that on the chart where we showed the totals for year to date on contracts in job holding offices, that there were 9 categories plus an other, and we have 7 regions. So how do those data points in that previous chart track with 7 area offices?
Well, and they don't match up specifically, and that's a very good point. These are our compliance regions. Petra, if maybe you can jump in here and talk about the specific differences. I think that down there in Southwest Washington, we do have the Columbia Gorge area carved out of there. And let me know if you're prepared to address that. And Petra, if you're talking, you're muted. Okay, well, John, to your point, these are compliance regions, but I believe that our order holding offices, there are 9, which includes, just kind of going by memory here, I know we have a Columbia Gorge, and I'm trying to think, and if anybody can help me out, because my memory is not serving me as I'm looking at this office, what the second order holding office is that's not represented here on this chart.
This is Tamara.
Thank you.
In region 1, where Yakima is, the Sunnyside office, the Columbia Gorge office, and Yakima are all in that area.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I always forget about Sunnyside. I always want to put it with Yakima, and it's its own thing.
Right. And then the other quote unquote is just, it's kind of includes everyone except that is, because there's very few of them. And so there's a few in this number 7 region, some down in Auburn and Grays Harbor, couple in Snohomish. So they're kind of spread out that way. And that's why we kind of, it's such a small amount. We put them all together in the other category. So that's the other column. And we could give you more details about that if you need.
Does that answer your question, John?
It does clarify that the compliance districts don't track with which counties are served by order holding offices. It would be helpful to see a map that shows where applications go based on the county. So for example, does Lewis and Pacific County go to Yakima or to the Columbia Gorge, for example, for a contract application?
Noted. I don't know if a graph currently exists, but if it doesn't, then we'll make one.
Thank you.
Next slide, please.
Oh, Bertha, I had a question. This is
Yes,
Rosalinda.
Go ahead.
So when you're talking about you reach total farm workers 5,150, does that mean you actually talk to 5,150 workers?
That number represents the actual workers that we gave some type of information to, whether that be information in a presentation or that we talked to at housing, but that is an actual worker number that received information or communication during our visit.
Right, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Of course. Next slide, please. So this is the same data represented in a table. I think it's a little bit easier to read in this format, but we wanted you to be able to see it geographically too. So these are the number of site visits since the beginning of this year to 4/19/2022. So it's pretty current. Our total site visits have been 110. And again, the workers contacted at 5,150. You'll see obviously that certain regions have more volume. I think this matches up pretty well with the graph that Petra spoke about earlier. For example, in Walla Walla, this is a region where we've got a lot of quote unquote special contracts like sheep herders and those kind of niche contracts. So what we've been doing as a team is that we are shifting our specialists to help out in other areas. For example, Our Walla Walla compliance specialist has spent quite a bit of time with our Yakima specialist and assisting her in doing site visits so that we get some pretty comprehensive coverage. But that is where we're at. Also, I will say too that when we have compliance specialists out on leave or extended leave, we are making the necessary adjustments to make sure that we're getting coverage across the state.
This is great. I agree with Michelle that this is really important progress. And this chart is good, but the map, including the map, is way better. I mean, I
Okay.
like both, but the map
Good.
really helps. Thank you.
Good. I'm glad. I'm glad that we're presenting it both ways. Like I said, I tend to like the table better, but I think that's just how my brain works. So we'll certainly continue to present it both ways. Next slide, please. So I want to talk about field checks next. And I've been looking forward to this. I think this is going to be the favorite part of what I'm about to say. So as you know, just as a background, so we're all starting from the same place. Field checks, different than site visits. It has its own CFR section. Field checks, if a worker is placed on a clearance order, the SWA must notify the employer in writing that the SWA, through its ES offices and or federal staff, must conduct random, unannounced field checks to determine and document whether wages, hours, and working and housing conditions are being provided as specified in the clearance order. And there's some other sections, but specifically I include a subsection C, which is field checks must include visits to the work site at a time when workers are present. When conducting field checks, ES staff must consult both employees and the employer to ensure compliance with the full terms and conditions of the employment. So our authority for a field check is if there's a placement, a confirmed placement. And a placement is when a job seeker is referred by WorkSource to the job order, they're hired and they start working, whether that be an hour or a day or a week. That is a confirmed placement. And we have to have a confirmed placement to give us the authority to conduct a field check. And I know that there has been a lot of discussion in this committee about placements, about increasing placements. I'm happy to report to you that since our last meeting, we've had 5 confirmed placements. And actually, I want to qualify that in a moment to 4, and I'll tell you why. But we've had 5 placements, which is very exciting because, and granted, I can't confirm this, and I think maybe Alberto Isiorde or Juan Martinez can back me up on this, but I don't think that we've had any in the last couple of years. So it's very exciting that within a short period of time, we've had 5 placements. And I think that's a function of, just anecdotally, I think that that's a function of our employment connection staff following up on those placements, following up with the job seeker, following up with the employer, and advising our office. That is, in my opinion, going very, very smoothly. So we have performed 4 field checks in the last 30 days. And I actually want to qualify that by saying our 4th one was scheduled for yesterday. Our whole team did the prep, showed up to the employer's to the employer site. We spoke with the employer, and we were able to learn, unfortunately, that our placement that we thought had started working, they were hired, but they never showed up to work. So unfortunately, we didn't have the authority to perform the field check, even though we were ready to go and we had staff on site. We offered the employer to do the field check if they wanted to give us permission to do it voluntarily, to give them a review, an educational experience for both the employer and to allow them to, to benefit from the outcome of our review. And we unfortunately weren't able to do that, but we do have plans to return at a later date because the employer is interested in having that review. So we, like I said, all placements that were made and the field checks performed were since our March 2022 meeting. So that is something that we are really proud of, and I'm happy to answer any questions about employer response, which has been overwhelmingly positive, or a process, whatever you'd like to know about.
This is
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Rosalinda.
This is Rosalinda. I have a question. Are you going to follow up why those workers left the job or didn't show up?
Usually, well, I'm thinking I haven't dealt with this situation before, because in our other 3 field checks, we were able to confirm that they were hired and started working. Likely, yes. And I'm saying likely because I can't say for sure. So I want to hand it over to Mago, because he was there on site yesterday. I was not, and he has maybe more facts to share about why that seeker was not, well, they were hired, and why they didn't show up to work. So Mago, can you speak briefly to that?
When these 4 workers were all sent to one, they were all on with one employer, 4 workers sent to one company.
4 different employers.
4 different employers. And
Right.
none of them showed up to the employers?
Only one yesterday didn't show up. The rest, the other three, we completed the field check, the full process. The workers were working. It's just this one instance in which they didn't show up to work.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. We can move on, or Mago, I want to give you the chance to, if you wanted to give us any more insight on that.
All right, this is Rosalinda. I would like to hear it. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Go ahead, Mago.
Well, it looks, we did this field check because I talked with the worker and to confirm that he was hired with the employer. But when we went to the employer, he said that the worker didn't show up, which seems like was a misunderstanding. Looks like the job seeker or the candidate that we refer went to a different orchard, is what it seems like. And he was hired in that different orchard, so the employer, the job seeker never show up with the employer. So that's what happened. What we planning to do next time is just confirm with the employer too, just to make sure that when we go to do the field check, we confirm that the employer hired them.
And our field checks have been, 2 of them have been in the Yakima region. One of them was in the Western Washington region, and yesterday's would have been in the Wenatchee region. Or actually, I think I have that wrong. I think it was one in, we've had them in the Wenatchee region, in the Western Washington region, and in the Yakima region so far.
This is Victoria. I have a question. At some point, Bertha, will we be able to get like the results or to review of those, or at least, you know, I know some of the information you maybe can't share, but some sort of results from those field checks?
So this probably is a question for Dan. We do send we have an exit interview with the employer where we share the outcome. And also, I also want to highlight that as part of this field check process, we also do a payroll review too, where we go through the payroll records to confirm that that everything is correct and all the elements are present that need to be there. We do send a closing letter noting any issues that we found and giving the employer 5 days to confirm with us that those have been rectified. This, like I said, this is probably a question for Dan, but perhaps we could provide redacted copies of those letters just so that the committee is aware of the types of issues that we're talking to employers about.
Yeah, but Bertha, I think that's right. Victoria, I think there's probably way to do this with employer confidentiality, what it might be, and we'll get back with affirmative responses. Sort of is like a summary maybe at the end of the year. We did X number of field checks, and these are the types of things we saw. This is how they were resolved. A sort of general painting a general picture of what occurred across the state. I imagine is something that we can do if that works for you.
That would be great, Dan. Also, one other follow-up on that. If you guys do find an issue, are you able to go out and do another field check to verify that it's been remedied, or you just rely on, you know, their word that they've done it? Or is there some sort of follow-up to verify?
Well, the follow-up is usually like a communication from the employer. Like, for example, we had, for example, in the housing, we had a smoke detector that didn't have a battery, a garbage can that didn't have a lid. My understanding is that the employer was able to fix that immediately on site. So we were able to witness that, I think is if I remember correctly, is how that went. Other things like payroll issues, we ask for basically confirmation from the employer, like a written confirmation email, or a copy of the correct pay stub showing that those issues have been fixed. With regards to a follow-up field check, I'll have to look at the CFR. I think that you can. But in my experience as state monitor advocate, and also in this role, employers have really been cooperative have really been responsive in fixing those issues immediately.
Is there any way we could, or Dan, both of you, is there any way we could get that report quarterly rather than the end of the year?
Can you be more specific? To which report are you referring?
The report that Dan mentioned about, you know, basically Victoria asking for results of field checks. I'm just saying that because it'd be nice to see the trend, or for us to look and see if there's any major issues showing up. If there's a way to get it quarterly, I would really appreciate that.
Yeah, I hear you, Rosalinda. Why don't we take that back? We're happy to provide information on as frequent a basis as we can. It's really a matter of confidentiality. So we'll figure out a way and a cadence to do it and get back to the committee with that.
And I understand that. So we're just looking like the issues. I guess the trends I'm looking for is time period to resolution. And also, what are the main issues that we're seeing that are showing up? It'll also show the increased or lack of increased activity by staff. So we have more staff, more compliance staff. How is the actual compliance work moving forward?
Got it, Rosalinda.
Thank you.
Take that as an action item.
And Rosalinda, just to clarify, and maybe obviously Dan seems like he is attuned to what you're meaning, but what, in addition to what was presented regarding number of site visits and regions visited, would you want included in that report?
I guess it's what Victoria's talking about is results.
Oh, the field check.
Yeah, the field checks. And
Okay.
I'm talking about the field checks results for and length of time between the finding of an issue and the resolution of it. And then some kind of, you know, explanation of what that actual resolution was. For example, well, I just can't think of anything right now, but I'm trying to figure out, because this is a complaint we've had many times from workers, is people show up, we explain to them what the issue is, and then we don't know what happens, nothing. Right?
Well, I will just so far, and this is easy for me to say because there's been, I mean, I say few, there's been 3 completed. That's actually a lot. given the history of our office. But I will say that I do know as a fact that all the issues that were found during our field checks were in fact resolved within 5 days.
Well, and the idea is that there's going to be an increasing number of field checks, right? And so that's
hope
what,
so.
yeah, that's why we want to establish a process and a framework for seeing how that moves forward.
Understood. Next slide, please. I think that might just be background noise. So looking ahead, what we're focusing on now, regarding our compliance team, we are going to be building on the feedback received during our site visits from both employers and workers. As I said, I want to give a shout out to Delia Pena, who really took a lot of time and really thoughtfully communicated the feedback that she had with regards to witnessing multiple members of our compliance staff delivering this information. So now that we are all out doing the work, we're trained, we have the information, we're building these relationships. At this time, we feel like the time is ripe to really elevate our service, our site visit delivery. We're going to be focusing on communication strategies to best inform our audiences, specifically meeting people where they are with regards to terminology, with regards to how we explain things. We're also going to be training our staff with the goal of uniform site visit experience across compliance region. Each of our compliance staff have their own styles. Obviously, they're their own people. We're not robots. We want to preserve that their ability to, deliver with their own style. But we do want to give employers some predictability about what to expect, give them an opportunity to learn about what's required to make those, changes even before we get there. And then obviously really improve and just kind of continue to refine the quality of information and the effectiveness of the information. And give workers specific steps, specific contact information, specific guidance about what to do and who to contact and what their rights are. So that's something we're going to be really focusing on this month. With regards to our complaint system, we are going to be continuing to work with Employment Connections. I just had a very productive meeting yesterday with Juan Martinez about the complaint system to improve our internal complaint communication and train all of our staff to really issue spot. Issue spotting, it's like, I guess this is the lawyer in me, but just kind of looking for being able to recognize and identify what potential issues are. And we're also working hard to really streamline that complaint system process so that we are intaking those complaint systems intaking those complaints, and by we I mean ASWS, from our local offices and really getting on these issues immediately. And in my opinion, I think that's going very well. Any questions about looking ahead, what we plan in this next month? Any suggestions from committee members about what you think would elevate our service delivery? I certainly want to hear those.
So Berta, this is Uriel.
Hey, Uriel.
So when you mention in terms of your compliance, and what is it that you are looking at? I mean, is it compliance to the contract, the HOA contract? Is it safety? And you mentioned the wage and hour and things like that. It almost sounded like a company-wide audit.
Well, with field checks, I really hate to use the word audit with field checks because audit is like a dirty word to most people. And I feel I can say this with a straight face. We want these field checks to be helpful to the grower as well. We want them to be a kind of a health check where they are getting this review, they're getting this expertise. We're looking through everything with a really fine tooth comb and spotting things and giving them the information that they need to make corrections. With regards to site visits, as you know, they're not field checks. We're not looking at payroll records during site visits. We have no authority to look at payroll records during site visits unless the worker wants to show us their pay stub or has a question about it or wants to know, if we're checking to make sure they're being paid the right wage if they're showing us their pay stub. But we are looking for compliance with the ETA 790. Specifically what the employer is giving them. Are they getting a copy of their contract in a language they can understand? And these are just examples. Obviously, we have a checklist that we're continuing to develop. Also, their rights under the 3/4 guarantee. Are they working on Sundays? Are they being expected to work on Sundays if that's not on their contract? What's their meal situation? What's their transportation situation? Like I said, these are examples. There's obviously much more area that we cover, but that's what we're looking for with regards to our site visits. I want to say too that we're also doing a pre-site visit contract review. We're looking for things like if there's a joint employer or something like that, is that being handled correctly? Kind of some of the more, I guess, complicated issues. We're issue spotting those before we get to the farm to make sure that we can give that information to the employer and we can check with the workers that everything is being conducted correctly. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
I've got a question to follow up on that.
Please.
This is Victoria.
Hey, Victoria.
So if an issue comes up during a field check that's kind of like outside of your scope of the field check, what you're looking for in terms of the contract compliance, do you refer that out to another agency? Like if there's a health and safety issue or something that you see or someone tells you during the visit, would you refer that to like LMI or something like that?
Well, it depends on the nature of the issue. For example, if it's something like sexual harassment or sexual assault or something like that, that does not allow for informal resolution. So that is going to be going to an enforcement agency, likely the EEOC. If it's something like for example, we had on a site visit, I know you're talking about field checks, but on a site visit we had like for example, the porta potties had not been serviced in quite a while. And our compliance specialist was able to talk with the employer, and I think that the porta potties were serviced that same day. For those types of issues, obviously our goal is that they're rectified because we want the safety, we want the workers to not have to experience an unsafe condition for any longer than they have to. And we also want to give the employer a chance to fix it. Because that's the goal. That's our goal, to ensure the worker's safety, not to get anybody into trouble, if you will. So with regards to your question about a field check, certain issues, depending on the nature of the issue, they would necessarily need to be referred to an enforcement agency. But other issues, for example, wage and hour issues, if there's an issue with with payroll or accounting, et cetera, those issues, under the regulation, the CFR for field checks, it does allow the employer 5 days to fix it, to confirm with us that it's fixed. And in that case, if it is fixed and we're satisfied with the solution, we would not refer that to, like, for example, DOL.
Bertha, Mike Gempler here. Can you hear me?
I can. Go ahead.
Hi. So on either field checks or site visits, are you verifying that people are staying in the housing that's listed on the contract? Are you looking at payroll records and verifying that everybody's being paid what they're supposed to be paid, including corresponding workers, that sort of thing? Do you go to that level of detail?
We do. Well, let's talk about field checks first. Field checks, yes, we do. And I'm happy to share the guide from DOL that we use for field checks. For field checks, like it's starting with payroll. And just for your own edification for the committee, we have done field checks in groups of 4. We have usually 2 people doing the payroll review with the employer, and we have 2 people out in the field interviewing domestic and H-2A workers, and then also going to the housing, each housing that's on the ETA 790. I want to say up front that we are not housing inspectors. We don't pretend to be housing inspectors. We go through the checklist that DOL provides with regards to housing. But that checklist does include things like smoke detector batteries and mattresses on beds and, you know, windows that open and, you know, those types of things. So with regards to field checks, yes, there is a great level of detail, which makes them so valuable to both the workers and also to the employer. With regards to site visits, we obviously have the ETA 790 in advance that we are reviewing prior to visiting the farm. So we know where the housing is. We know what they should be paying, what they should be paid. We know, you know, what the employer has set out as their process for interviewing domestic workers, et cetera. And we are also looking at the housing, but like, for example, if the workers aren't there or something, we're not like going into the housing. Many of our site visits we do after work hours, just because the employer prefers that for obvious reasons, and we are talking to the workers at the housing. But we don't have the authority, and it's really not the purpose of the site visit to go into the level of fine, thorough review that we do in a field check.
And Berta, thank you for that, because that was my question in terms of, and Mike, for you chiming in, because part of it is the last thing we want employers or even employees to be confused that it's a safety inspection.
Indeed.
Or it's a wage and hour audit that L&I does. So if we can clear that up, that's I think that would help us.
Our role is very distinct from DOL, you know, from a housing inspection. However, there are a lot of the things that we're looking at, particularly in a field check, that do feel like that. Again, I want to stay as far away from the word audit as we can, because, you know, I really want to frame this in a positive light. Again, we have had an overwhelmingly, in all of our field checks, we've had a very positive response from employers, and we've had cooperation from both employers and workers in conducting those field checks. But that's, I mean, it is very thorough. And again, if the committee is interested, and we're happy to share that guide that we use, that we have received from the Department of Labor.
Yeah, thank you, Berta. This has been a good conversation. And just to follow up on what Uriel was saying, we do, I think that that issue of workers being confused about what agency is coming out is real. And part of the challenge of it, I think, is what they can expect, because I think when a worker talks to someone from the government and says something about a problem they have, a concern, either about wages or health and safety or whatever it is, right? They don't know whether or not this agency has authority over that issue, right? They will be thinking, oh, they're going to help, right? They're going to address my concern. And then when nothing changes, their takeaway is, you know, that
didn't do anything.
That it did, right. And I do think it's a challenge for us going forward, or for the agency. I know, when we talk about interagency cooperation, to kind of think about how to try to clarify that to workers, in terms of who you are and what you can do, what you can and can't do, and maybe what they have to do if they really want something addressed. I mean, if it's not something you can address. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Well, and also I don't think that the confusion is limited to workers. I think the employers also have a lot of confusion about like, whoa, like what's the difference between ASWS and our MSFW outreach workers? Like it's very confusing. And I think that, I really need feedback. I think our team really needs feedback from the committee on how to do this, on how to kind of distinguish ourselves from other agencies, because it's really not intuitive. It's kind of like, field checks, our site visit. I can see that as being quite confusing to both employers and workers. So I'd love feedback on that.
This is Rosalinda. I have a question and then some feedback.
Yes.
Do you check about workers being moved from one state to another? Like if they're with multiple employers, are they out of state employers? Do you ask about, did you come in from California or directly from Mexico? Based on what the contract says? Because we're looking at contracts that have multiple locations on them. I mean, there's one contract, I believe, that has over 20 locations.
Right. That usually we know that information in advance from speaking to the employer, from talking to our FLC team, and then obviously from interviewing ultimately interviewing the worker too. That is valuable feedback to include that, to kind of focus in on, to focus in and question, what the work history of the worker has been. But again, I think that is mostly done in our prep work. For example, right now, most of our contracts, we know that we know from the employer, from communicating with them in the weeks before the site visit and setting up the site visit, that, this is when I'm getting my workers. This is when they had their visa appointment, et cetera. We're getting a lot of those details up front, and we're going into the compliance visit knowing that. And that's something that I think we've really been focusing on the team to do our research before we get there, so that we can talk to specific things. But I
guess what I'm asking is,
I will note that. Go ahead.
Yeah, that you verify with the workers. I'm remembering an instance where we ran into these workers that went on strike actually in Whatcom County. And one of their biggest complaints was that they had been moved from several areas and they wanted to go home. It's like, why are we still here? We thought we were going to be done by now. And so I think that's a question that would be good to ask, to verify where the worker came from, and what do they know about when they're supposed to go home. So that's one question that I think is important to start tracking with the H-2A workers. But my suggestion was, with this interagency cooperation and the worker confusion about why somebody from the state, they just like, it's a government person coming in that's supposed to be doing the right thing, inspecting or safety checks or whatever. And there's always this perception, this visible perception of those government employees having this amazing, good feeling conversations with the employer, which gives the impression that, they don't really care about the workers. So that's one thing, which is like, I guess some ways it can't be helped, because that the employer wants to make sure, that their inspection goes well or their relationship is good, but the workers are not getting the same kind of reception. So that's one thing. But the other is, I'm wondering, is it possible, and I know sounds, I don't know, I'm just thinking if I were a worker out there, if state agencies were color coded with some kind of, almost like a safety vest that they would put on, Employment Security Department wears this color, LNI wears this color, and they just put it on over their clothing so that it's easily seen from the fields or from far away. If it's this color, it's an LNI safety inspection or whatever. You know, is there a way to do that so it's easily visible? That's my suggestion, because I can't think of any other way. Because a badge is hard to see, and there are workers that can't read. So,
Well, I love the creativity. I know Uriel's on this call and he's listening. I'm noting this, Rosalinda, and thank you for being creative. I love that. I see Dan is kind of looking at me like, wrap this up. So I am going to wrap this up. I believe this is our last slide, but you'll hear from me in a bit when I talk to you about the ASWS report.
Yeah, thank you, Bertha, for leading that and for good discussion, obviously to be continued. And we're happy to take input outside of this committee, these committee meetings as well. But I do want to move the agenda along with people here with some limited time. So the next piece of our agenda is to touch base quickly on a couple of the report recommendations from 2020. We're going to start, next slide, please, with Gary Kamimura, who's going to provide an update on the Department of Labor request regarding suppressing or unsuppressing employer information. And while it's not on the slide or on the agenda, Gary is going to speak for a minute about a proposed rule the Department of Labor put out that we have yet to fully analyze, but has farm worker implications that we wanted to make you aware of, and may come back to the committee for a discussion at some future point. So Gary, if you're on, let me turn things over to you.
Yes, I am here. Hope folks can hear me okay. And thank you, Dan. Good morning, committee members. So again, Gary Kamimura, Policy Manager here at Employment Security. So wanted to just bring you up to speed on where we are with the request that you as a committee made of staff quite a while ago. It was actually in the fall at your October meeting that you asked staff to pursue a waiver of the regulations, the Wagner-Pisa regulations, at section B2 of 20 CFR 653-501, that requirement to suppress employer information in our agricultural clearance orders in our agricultural recruitment system. So subsequent to that request, we went right into legislative session, as you may recall. And at the time we briefed you on this, you may recall that per the federal guidance in the Training and Employment Guidance Letter 818, which sort of governs waiver requests to the Department of Labor, we do need to have the governor's stamp of approval. So it really took us really through the session where the governor's office, as you can appreciate, was very, very busy for us to connect with, in this case, Caitlin Jekyll, who is the governor's senior policy advisor for labor. So we had that meeting in March, received the go-ahead from the governor's office to make the request of the Department of Labor. So I don't know if you can see it in the chat or not. I tried to load the draft request, the correspondence that we plan to send. So hopefully that's something you can take a look at your own leisure, but know that as part of the federal guidance, in addition to explaining specifically what we want to waive, why we want to waive it, and how we intend to mitigate what might be any adverse impacts of the waiver, we are required to do a public comment on the request. So for your information, after this meeting, we want to brief you first. We do intend to issue a public comment notice to the system, basically everyone who is on our listserv, letting them know about a 15-day public comment period, and that a notice will link to a draft of our request that will go from our commissioner, Cami Feek, on behalf of the governor to the Secretary of Labor for consideration. Now, as you can see in the slide, The secretary, upon receipt of that request, has basically 90 days to review and respond to the governor on that request. So the department does try to be expeditious in those reviews, but again, it could be up to 3 months before we hear back. Another thing just to note is during that public comment period, we will send that notice to all of you just by separate email, so you can forward it to any parties that you would like that may not be on our listserv distribution. So that way we can get good coverage for individuals who may want to comment on the request. Know that in our request, we do talk about, why do we feel we can mitigate the potential impacts of the waiver? And as you'll recall, when you suppress employer information, the idea is to somewhat force domestic workers to go through our one-stops to get the information, to hear about the job, to hear about their rights as workers, to hear about the other services that our one-stop system can provide. As you heard from Bertha in her report, we feel that as we are making significant investments in our agricultural services, that we have staff who, through field checks and field visits, can follow up with workers and provide that information to them. We feel that within our one-stops, that our employment specialists have the information that they can also share. So we feel that we've, again, got the investments and are really bringing to bear the type of staff capacity that we need to hopefully mitigate what might be the ability of workers to report directly to an employer and potentially bypass our agricultural recruitment system. But again, we'll open that for comment to see what folks might have to say about that. One thing I also want to note is, in that request, you'll be able to see references to this committee in a couple of ways. One, we do note that this committee did affirmatively vote to support this request. And then we also note that as part of our mitigation strategy, we do intend to track, how are we doing with respect to notifying workers of their rights, of letting them know about the services of the one-stop system. And so we'll continue to monitor that. We'll continue to bring that information to the committee. And if at some point we feel that, notwithstanding, let's say we are granted that request, that we feel that the benefits are not outweighing the risks or concerns, we have the administrative capacity, even though we have the waiver, to not continue to implement it. So just know that that is another option out there. So let me stop there on this particular piece and see if there are any questions.
So,
Okay.
and Gary, just to reiterate, so after this meeting, what we'll do is once the notice for public comment is out, we'll send an email to this group. And again, you all can see that notice, which comes with a letter, the draft letter that we would send to the secretary to then review and comment as you might wish, and or pass it along to anyone else you think might be interested.
Gary, this is John on the committee. I didn't see the attachment that you were trying to put into the chat. Maybe you could have staff circulate that to us so we could see the draft proposal. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I tried, but it says something about my network being disconnected. So yeah, we'll get it to you through a separate email. No worries. Thank you. All right, so let me turn just real briefly to the other topic that Dan asked me to speak to, which is not on the agenda, but is somewhat late breaking. So yesterday, April 20th, the U.S. Department of Labor issued a notice of proposed rulemaking for the Wagner-Peiser regulations at 20 CFR parts 651, 652, 653, and 658. The notice was primarily, in terms of its advertisement, to be around the department's intent to basically reel back staffing flexibility for Wagner-Peiser employment services and requiring state merit staff deliver those services only. But we see that beyond that particular regulation at 652, they are also looking to clean up, streamline, and make additional protections, as it were, to the migrant seasonal farm worker regulations at parts 651, 653, and 658. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to put a link in the chat to that rulemaking notice, so you can see what we are at this time looking at, analyzing, and developing a briefer around for our leadership. But in the event we plan to comment or desire to comment on any of those proposed rule changes, I'm expecting that Dan will like us to share those same thoughts and analyses with this committee as well. So, but know that the policy team, in coordination with Bertha and her team, Alberto Isiorda and his team, Renee Maldonado, our state monarch advocate, will be collectively, again, analyzing the proposed rule changes, particularly as it relates to the agricultural space, and coming up with our thoughts on the rule changes and any recommendations for state response to those proposed rule changes. Okay, so Dan, I'll turn it back to you unless there are any questions about that.
Thanks, Gary. That was very helpful information. I hadn't seen that announcement yet. Do you think that Federal Register notice of proposed rulemaking could be circulated to the committee as well?
Yes, I'm going to put a link in the chat here, and if not, we'll put a link in a separate email just in case it doesn't take here.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Gary. And you should feel free to send both the waiver information and that link in an email to the listserv we have for the committee. And correct me if I'm wrong here on time frame, Gary, but I think we have a couple months to comment. So we wanted to share the rule with you today, because your organizations or others may want to comment on their own. And just to sort of reaffirm what Gary's saying, we're reviewing the rule. If we as an agency and perhaps the governor's office want to submit a comment, we'll return to the committee, or either way, we'll return to the committee with our further analysis of the rule and what we intend to comment on if we are going to comment. And Gary, just want to confirm we're talking about a 2-month timeline here, correct?
Yes, June 21st is the deadline to submit comments. And just to note, while employment security as a state workforce agency will probably submit comment, it's certainly not restricted, of course, to us as an agency. The public at large is certainly welcome to comment in whatever form it would like.
All right. And we do know that sometimes these changes can be difficult to understand if you're not steeped in it. So again, at a minimum, we'll come back and maybe do a deeper dive, sort of just walking through what they are. So
certainly the notable changes without, yeah, that would be good. Mm-hmm.
Any questions for Gary?
And I did pop the link to the Federal Register information into the chat, so hopefully you'll have that, but we'll send it separately as well.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Gary, and I appreciate your coming back to explain to us what changes, what this would look like in at ESD, because I know, I mean, I actually have been reviewing them this morning,
oh, there you go.
and it's difficult for those of us not steeped in the organization of the department to understand, on the ground what it would, what the changes would mean. So I appreciate that.
Yeah. I mean, speaking for my colleagues, I think there are at least a couple, 3 proposed rule changes that are we consider relatively significant. A lot of it is just technical language correction, trying to align terms and whatnot, but several of them do have potential impacts, and those are the ones we'll probably certainly share with you once we feel pretty comfortable in our understanding and analysis.
So in your opinion, are those like good things or problematic?
I think those are the conversations we have to have internally to get all the thoughts on the table. Some of them relate to, how does the Department of Labor, for example, determine what is or is not a significant MSFW state. Some have to do with changes in the requirements or how one can do a field check. Just to name a couple of things that you may want to, pay attention to as you look through your own lens at the
Mhm.
proposed changes. So,
All right, thank you. We'll have those conversations also.
Yeah, and Rosalind, I think what we can do, I think what makes sense to do from here is we can come to the next meeting with this as an agenda item where we walk through what the proposed changes are, namely the notable ones. And I think it'd be helpful for us to get all of your input in determining. We can help you understand what the impact is. We can, of course, provide our view too, but I think getting your input on what if you think something is good, bad, or indifferent would be helpful. So we'll have that as an agenda item for our May meeting.
Great, thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much, Gary.
thank you, everybody. Have a good day.
All right, we have one more quick update related to the customer experience study, and I'm going to turn it over to Gustavo for that update.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Dan. What we would like to share with you is the revised timeline for the customer experience studies. Originally, we're thinking in starting the RFP process on this month, on April. Unfortunately, my unit is short-staffed with 3 researchers, and but we will retake this next week. And so we're thinking instead of starting in April, we will start in May. That doesn't affect the time that we are hoping to collect data for what I call the phase 1 study, which is the portion that we agreed last time that would be funded with the ASWS extra funds that they have available for this fiscal year. In regards to the phase 2, what I call the phase 2, which is the customer experience study that will be funded, or that we hope will be funded with the USDA Specialty Crop Block Grant. We're hoping that would start the RFP process in October if we're awarded the grant. Good thing about this application is that we were notified by the Washington State Department of Agriculture that our study has moved into the next phase, meaning they intend to include our study into their application to the United States Department of Agriculture. However, our award is still pending. We're still in conversations with the Washington State Department of Agriculture, and we have been asked to provide additional information. And we will continue throughout this process. Our understanding is for the next 2 months. And we will expect probably within 2 months to learn about whether we have been awarded the grant or not by the USDA. Any questions?
Gustavo, this is John. Not a question, but just I have had experience using this program, and usually USDA AMS approves the state's recommendations unless there's a eligibility compliance issue. So I had a good conversation about this proposal with Director Sanderson, and I know that though he's not on the call today, Ignacio Marquez had briefed him on it as well. And this was flagged for him as a priority. And so I think that's why I made the final cut, and I would expect it to be funded as a result.
Very good to know, John. Thank you so much for sharing that. So Dan, I don't have anything else.
All right. Any further questions or comments on this issue before we move to our next topic?
Yeah, could you give us a sense? So the RFP will be issued in May. That's what you're hoping.
No, we will start drafting the RFP, Michelle.
Okay.
And that's when we would start engaging with some of you. Hopefully by next May meeting, we will have the draft for you to review.
Thank you for clarifying that. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Gustavo. All right, our next topic of conversation is around some of the adverse weather we've seen around the state. This is a topic that Rosalinda Guillen has put forward, and we appreciate it. It is the type of topic we want to discuss in this committee. I do want to note we've got a couple staff from the governor's office here to listen to this conversation, Caitlin Jekyll and Salvador Salazar. So thank you for joining us. Kind of broken this topic down into talking about assessments of crop damage, how that works, worker needs, and then state and stakeholder response. In short, we've had some abnormal weather in certain parts of the state, and there's a concern that that's going to lead to a degree of crop damage that would lead to less work. And I think what we'll do here is, Rosalinda, you brought the topic forward, so I want to give the floor to you to sort of, at a high level, speak to the view and concerns and what you're hoping to see out of this discussion. And then I do want to turn it over to the employer side to see if voting members there might have some insight they want to share about how assessments are done. And ultimately, what we want to get out of this conversation, I think, is some mutual understanding is around what is occurring and what we should keep in mind, and what a good response or potential response would be should we see some adverse impacts on workers due to the weather. So Rosalinda, with that, why don't I turn things over to you?
Thank you. Thank you for allowing us this time. We've been getting calls about concerns regarding the availability of jobs and the impact on farm workers with the cold snap all across the state, actually. And it seems to be spotty, but the area that we've gotten more information from is the Wenatchee area. And so we believe that this is an issue that these kinds of issues, especially climate related issues, need to be brought to this committee because it affects the H-2A workers that are living or being housed in certain areas, but also the availability of jobs for domestic workers. And so I think in the future, we would like to have this brought forward as soon as possible so that we can deal with any further impacts. The background for this, our concern also includes the recovery that some of the workers are trying to grasp post the pandemic, the heat domes, the flooding, the harsh winter, and now this unexpected cold snap that is actually impacting the trees, the fruit trees. Even in our area, the blossoms from the raspberries are being impacted. So this is about the blossoms on the trees for cherries, apricots. We also heard of instances of certain farms losing their asparagus because of the cold. So these are jobs lost for farm worker families. And we want to work with the industry and also the state on doing the type of assessment that includes labor input and labor participation to understand how this is going to be dealt with. We believe it needs to be addressed. It needs to be recognized that it's an impact, a financial, or shall I say, an economic impact on farm worker families, especially domestic workers. So we did ask for a governor's representative to try to start to look at this now. How are we going to support the domestic farm worker families living in these areas now with this additional impact on their economic well-being? So on the H-2A front, what are those workers going to be doing if there's not enough jobs for the number of workers that were brought in? And what's the long-term projection for the harvest and other jobs that could have been impacted? And also, we want to make sure that we prioritize if there's not or a lack of jobs or less jobs than we were expected. We want farm worker families that are living in the area to have priority access to those jobs. So I think that these are issues that we need to cover in this committee and need to work out in a way that makes sense, that is fair, but also provides the attention that H-2A workers need if there's too many workers here and not enough jobs. So this is a discussion we want to start with everybody, because we're looking at all the way down the line, including the impact that it's going to have on warehouse workers, on shipping and other, the thinning especially that's coming up, but also other workers along the production line of the whatever product that there may be. So we're asking that if necessary, the governor's office looks at some kind of disaster relief again for farm worker families, if it's needed. We're particularly interested in the assessment that's going to be done about answering all of these questions that I just brought up, and we want to be part of that assessment. We want to know what is the normal assessment that's done. We understand it's not that easy because, you know, this is a weather issue, but we also know that the farmers and the farm workers have knowledge that can kind of help to project what they expect things are going to look like. And we want to be part of this process, whatever that is, to do the assessment so that workers in the fields and in the communities can have some fair relief from this. And I don't know if anybody else on the labor group wants to say anything additional. Did I leave anything out or anything else that needs to be mentioned?
This is Edgar. So just when Rosalinda was talking, it was just kind of, and looking over some of the earlier discussion on the numbers of where workers are. Rosalinda mentioned lots of these, the information that we've been receiving have been coming from the Wenatchee area, which is also one of the places where there's a lot of H-2A workers. So I think a question I would have, if there's an impacted area that is not going to be producing, or there's not much work right now, and those workers are just there in their housing, you know, what's happening to them? You know, are they going to be compensated for time lost? If they're sent back home, and the contract has to be broken, you know, are they going to be compensated for that? You know, there's a lot of, you know, questions that were popping up when Rosalinda was talking. So yeah, those are just some of the things that I wanted to bring up.
There's an additional concern that was brought up to us also, the issue of the bees not being able to pollinate, that there's less of that happening, which will increase the you know, lack of production in the especially in the fruit tree industry. And of course the same up here in the berries. The raspberries is what we understand are the most fragile blossoming damage that's been done here. So a lot of questions, a lot of concern. I think from the labor perspective, we see this committee as essential to develop processes with the industry that are fair and that can address issues before they get really bad in our community. And that's the reason we wanted to bring it up, and we appreciate the time to do this.
Thank you, Rosalinda, and thank you, Edgar. And Rosalinda, I appreciate how you framed it with the bigger picture of, we're talking about a degree of adverse weather right now, but we've had wildfires, heat domes, other natural issues disrupting agriculture. And so I appreciate you framing it as that bigger issue. And the points that you covered are well taken. And I think for today's purposes, and Rosalinda, you can let me know if this works for you, I think we can have some conversation here, just sort of establishing a baseline of what currently occurs in two respects. So number one, like I said, I think it'd be helpful to hear from the employer side about what occurs with assessments of agriculture damage. So we have a baseline understanding of what occurs there. And then we, and namely maybe Bertha and Alberta, sort of looking to you, we can make sure the committee understands, and we can send out written materials as well, what happens with H-2A contracts and workers when there is adverse weather, what sort of revisiting, you know, the manner in which we can direct domestic workers through our worksource system to other jobs. And we can also touch on some of the supports there. And by sort of establishing that baseline, that can help us, Rosalinda, to your point, discuss whether there are ways to do things differently or better on this topic. So I think with that, I want to first see if on the employer side, we have any commentary on the topic and perhaps education on what goes into an assessment on what I believe is an employer by employer basis, not an industry-wide view.
This is John today. There's not a single assessment process, I would say, as Dan was referring to. Most commodity organizations do try at some point during the season to generate estimates of how much total production there might be for marketing purposes, but that tends to be a statewide crop production estimate. And that varies year to year for, with other variables as well. In tree fruit, for example, if you have some damage to blossoms, you might have a lighter crop load, but with fewer fruit on a tree, you might have greater size, and the actual impact on the crop size could be offset somewhat in terms of the total amount of poundage of harvest. So those estimates tend to be very general for marketing purposes. The more specific estimates of exact damage from a weather event to individual farms and commodities tends to go through a process with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, whether that's reports to the Farm Service Agency for uninsured losses, or reports to their crop insurer that gets shared with the Risk Management Agency of USDA. And there is a process by which the USDA agencies, Washington State University Extension, the State Department of Agriculture, meet quarterly or as needed to assess results of weather events and make recommendations to the governor and the Secretary of Agriculture for disaster declarations. I know Ignacio Marquez is not on the call today, but Director Sanderson has been put in participation in that process for assessing how much total damage on individual farms and countywide there may have been for particular crops. So that crop estimation process does exist. The labor market impacts are frequently discussed, but they're not specifically attempt to be quantified as part of those disaster declarations. That might be something that we could ask, WSDA or USDA to potentially talk about. There was a lot of questions that Rosalinda asked, and I may have lost track of some of them. I think that as far as effects on existing H-2A contracts for workers who may see their work stranded, it might be best to have ASWS staff recap the three-quarter guarantee, for employees who have already arrived and would be guaranteed their income regardless of the ability to actually be doing the work.
Well, in addition, I think it's important to remember that we have the 50% rule that during the first 50% of the H-2A contract, employers must hire any qualified domestic workers for the position, whether they have H-2A employees or not. So if they overstaff, they're going to let H-2A employees go.
Hey, this is Jeff Peralta. I apologize if I'm difficult to hear. I've got a bronchitis cold going on, but I guess there's one thing I think these are good questions, and I think in our industry, our respective industry, we're all dependent on the weather and variables that are way out of our control. With our contract, the snow and excessive water out in the fields put us back a week. Our H-2A employees aren't arriving on time; they're arriving late. So these are all variables that we got to deal with. But our domestic employees, our domestic H-2A employees, they are guaranteed the three-quarter guarantee. So regardless, we will be paying them 75% of the hours put down for that contract. And I think, agriculture, we still have work to do regardless of that, you know, we have to get the work done. It's just going to be in a shorter amount of time. So yeah, there's some safeguards in place that will kind of help mitigate some of the issues, I think, as far as the transient weather issues we've had. That'd be my input.
Appreciate that input. Why don't we start with the assessment piece, and Rosalinda, see if you have any response, follow-up, or thoughts on next steps to bring employers and labor and the state together to sort of work through that, and then we'll pivot to H2A and domestic worker impacts.
So I guess on the assessment, so we have basically what I heard John say, that there's basically no like collective or industry-wide assessment process. It's employers talking to each other or trying to address it through USDA. I might have missed that, but I guess what I'm saying is that I feel like, and when we talk to farm worker families, it's like these assessments of the projections of jobs based on especially the harm to the blossom, that there's going to be a projection of less jobs in the near future in this season. So I think that's what I'm trying to figure out. How do we do that quicker? Is there a way to do that quicker to look at what kind of relief is needed? And then how do we get that relief to farm worker families faster because of the lack of jobs, or make a decision on, you know, the number of jobs? So it's just like trying to develop that kind of process. And if there's a way with this committee to have like a framework for these adverse weather incidents that are going to continue to happen, that links back to what Edgar mentioned about the number of H2A workers being present, and how do we monitor that, I guess is what I'm saying. Is there a way to add that adverse weather factor into the number of workers that are here, where they're at, and how we're monitoring that, especially with the field checks and the site visits and all of that work that's being done in the ground?
I got it, Rosalinda. So I'm hearing a couple of things in there. One is, and this would maybe involve some further work with the Department of Agriculture, if not the governor's office, and Ignacio isn't here, but that desire around sort of at least communication around assessments and what's occurring and worker impacts, so we can take that as an action item. I can put in the chat the CFR and the language around contract and possibilities. So basically what occurs, oh, I think somebody already put it in chat. Yeah, Renee put in the chat the language from the CFR on contract and possibilities. And so I think, Rosalinda, what I'm hearing your interest in is on the H2A side, when there are adverse weather impacts and this contract and possibility, which I think we speak to some extent, come into play, to be providing that information to the committee so that the committee understands what is occurring with H2A workers in a deeper sense when we have natural disaster type issues, weather related issues. Correct?
Sounds good.
Okay.
Yeah, and Dan, I think there's a couple things that I just want to add. I mean, one is, yes, there's the 3/4 guarantee and there's the contract and possibility, but my experience is that first of all, for H2A workers, the 3/4, I mean, if you're here for 2 months and you're sitting in the camp for 3 weeks, or, you know, let's say there's a month period in the middle of the summer where there is no work, but it'll be made up for, the idea is it'll be made up for the rest of the season. That actually has created some dire problems. I know we've had to go to food banks and try to find food for people because the employer is not responsible to provide any funds or food to workers who are off of work. As long as by the end of the season they make the 3/4 guarantee. And so that can be a really big impact, even though, yes, ultimately. But the other is if they sit there for a month and then it turns out that actually the fruit has been damaged, if we find out that the harvest work will really be significantly impacted because of this weather, there won't be that opportunity to make up the difference later. And people may be sent home. And so I think the idea is to add, I think that our impression is that the assessments that go on through the insurance, through WSDA, don't necessarily tend to include the impact on labor and on communities, at least right away. And it's often much later, the disaster declaration, as we even saw with the floods, you ultimately get a disaster and then there'll be maybe disaster UI by next winter. You know what I mean? And it's like, that's not when families need the help. So I guess I do agree, somehow including, trying to include more about assessments, looking down the pike at what are the assessments. And then not only, obviously there's economic harm to the employers and the growers, and that can be significant, and including the labor side in that.
I think that is the key point here, is that in crisis, whatever type of crisis, whether it be climate related or otherwise, that the voice of workers, of labor, be equitable to the industry needs. That somehow that equity has to be built into this process.
Understood, Rosalinda, and that makes sense. Okay, so I think there are two pieces to this. So there's bringing labor into the assessment process. And so I think for that, again, we'll take as an action item to touch base with agriculture department. Maybe again, like I said, the governor's office is on the call here, and there might be some broader thinking occurring, and perhaps engage at least a subgroup of this committee in the near future, as in before the next meeting on that topic. And then it seems that the second piece of this, per Michelle's good comments, is around the social safety net that's available, and the scale of the disaster matters, right? We in this committee, a key part of our conversation is around domestic recruitment, and if domestic workers are displaced by sort of smaller size events, then our goal as a committee, as ESD, with the customer study, is to have a better system to direct them to other jobs. There are, of course, times when those jobs, because of a natural disaster, don't exist, or as Michelle was rightly pointing out, issues with lapse in time with H-2A workers. And so I think there might be some further discussion around the social safety net that's available. The DUA program that we've talked about before is a federal program that comes into play sometimes late, as was the case here, which is for workers who don't otherwise qualify for unemployment insurance. There are, of course, workers authorized to work in the United States who have worked enough hours who can get that benefit, but there are others who can't, and there are others, I heard food bank and other type of supports that might be needed. So it seems there's sort of a two-part further discussion to have from here, one on working on the assessment piece, and one on the social safety net when work is lost. I see John's hand and then Victoria.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I just wanted to follow up on something that Rosalinda brought up, and also further explain that I want to make sure everyone understands that it's not as though there's a clear understanding of what the damage is that's not being shared at this point. All of my growers are telling me that the pollination issue is often a bigger concern for them than the immediate cold weather damage, and probably could potentially have a greater impact. And that's not immediately apparent. Bees might be back out in the orchard, and the flowers' lifespan may have been extended because of the cooler weather, but there may have been some damage to the pollen itself. And most growers are telling me it's going to be another 2 weeks before, on tree fruit, for example, they can tell whether fruit is beginning to develop, whether pollination was successful or not. So sometimes these events, it does take a bit of time to really get an initial assessment of what the potential crop impacts are. And that is usually pretty well known to both government and industry and the media in fairly short order once we start to be able to see what's going on. So it is not as though we have a very clear understanding of that and just have chosen not to share it with other impacted communities.
Thank you, John. Victoria?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring about a point. I know that, well, two things. The first thing is that unemployment insurance was mentioned, and some, even workers that do qualify for that, I just wanted to flag, like, and one example would be the cherry harvest. Leading up to the cherry harvest, once we get to that season, even if there was less work or folks couldn't get jobs because there wasn't enough work, there's less cherries on the trees, the unemployment insurance would be calculated based off of, a non-harvest work period, which is, significantly less money than what those workers are used to earning during the cherry harvest. So that would be impacted as well, even for those who do qualify for unemployment insurance. So that's just one thing I wanted to flag. And then another thing is, a couple of the growers I think mentioned the 3/4 guarantee. And my understanding is that if there was a significant scope and damage to some of these crops, and if they implemented the contract impossibility and claimed an act of God, that 3/4 guarantee would no longer apply. Can someone clarify if that's accurate?
This is my portion. It applies to the period that is approved by DOL. In other words, until the act of nature occurs, the 3/4 guarantee applies to that period, that shortened period.
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, and I just want to say I appreciate John's point that we don't know yet. And I think Rosalinda's intent with putting this on our agenda, which I appreciate also, is to kind of try to get ahead of things so that we are prepared once that is known, right? If it's significant, that we try to get ahead of it rather than wait until all information is in and then start thinking about a framework for response.
Well, if we wait too long, what we get is, desperation from our families that need help and support, and then eventually anger because nothing is being done to provide jobs. If they say, for example, they see H-2A workers, but they can't get the work, and this is where everything sort of hits that conflict point comes into play about, the agencies not checking the customer experience, or the hiring through ESD isn't working. All of these mechanisms that are supposed to give access to domestic workers are not functioning well. And so I think that this is one incident that we can use to track that and to continue to improve our work together on this committee. And I would like to have, reports from the industry representatives on this committee to let us know what's going on as we work together with the agencies to develop a framework, so that every time there's an incident like this, a climate incident, we jump into it as part of the agenda for this committee.
Rosalinda, this is Mike Gempler. Again, the 50% rule at least provides that structural framework for any staff to use, or for any agency response, in that the local workers are given preference and must be hired by the employer during the first 50% of the contract period. So that's a protection for the domestic workforce, so that if the workload is really significantly reduced, they don't need as many people as they would have normally needed, at least there's protection for the domestic workers. If they apply for the job, they have to be hired. And so I know that the concern is about the efficacy of the agencies and the processes to enforce that sort of thing, but at least that structural protection is in place.
I do understand that. I think what I would like to see is like, is there a way in this committee to be receiving that information as soon as we can? And maybe that's already built into it, but what we'd like to have it be clearer, especially like a bookmark. There was this weather incident that happened. So what does that do to the numbers that are being reported and the way that the agency is responding? The agencies are responding to this weather impact. So I'm looking for a way to have this reporting brought to this committee and be made public of our response to these weather incidents.
This is Mike again. Well, we have an immediate case in point to examine, and that is, the early areas of asparagus production that were stopped because they were snowed on in Pasco area and some other early areas. And so those asparagus cutters had to stop work. And so they're without work for, I don't know, maybe a couple of weeks anyways, where they normally would have been working. So I would assume that they would be going to the unemployment insurance system. And I'd be interested in knowing if there have been contacts, in Kennewick and Sunnyside by asparagus cutters, because they were hit. This was just last couple weeks. So there's an example we can look at right now.
That's exactly what I was looking for, that we begin to address. I don't want to exist as an advisory committee in a bubble to what's really happening out in the communities.
This is Victoria. Dan, I think you mentioned this, and I support the idea of maybe a smaller committee meeting between now and the next committee meeting to kind of dig into this a little bit deeper.
Yeah, I think there are a couple layers to this. So some of this discussion, particularly around assessments, is beyond ESD or U.S. Department of Agriculture or Washington Department of Agriculture related. So I think there's some work for us to do to figure out the best way to approach that. Some of this is about what is occurring, to Rosalinda and Mike's good point. So sort of updates on, when contract possibilities occur due to weather for H2A workers, what's happening there. On the domestic side, are domestic workers being referred to other jobs, or to what degree are they accessing unemployment insurance? And then another layer, I think, particularly when we have large disasters, is sort of a look at the social safety net that is or is not there for workers who are or are not qualified for UI. So I think what we'll take, if it works for the committee, and yeah, Victoria, I think at least a subset of this group that wants to focus on these issues, doing so outside just our monthly committee meetings makes sense. So why don't we take all that information and come back to the committee with some next steps, which we can share out over email in the near future. All right, Rosalinda, thank you again for bringing this topic to the committee. I do want to stop there so we can make sure to get to the budget discussion. Why don't we take a 10-minute break and reconvene at 10:45? Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you. Again, a reminder, we are recording. Your continued participation in this meeting equals consent to being recorded. We're now going to turn to a discussion on the 2022 report, namely revisiting the budget. But first, let me turn things over to Bertha, who is going to quickly run through the timeline and just confirm we're on the same page here on that. So Bertha.
Hey, everybody. I'm going to talk with you briefly about our plan for the ASWS report. As we talked about last meeting, we are required to submit a report every other year. So just, I think I'm going to start at the very last bullet point first. That date that it's read, Halloween, 10/31/22, that is the date for publication of the report. So that is like our drop dead date where the report is going to be published. So this, I just wanted to take this opportunity to manage some expectations for this report. This iteration is not a comprehensive review like the 2020 report was. In case you haven't reviewed that report lately, it was pretty comprehensive in its legislative history, in its explanation of the background and historical data. The 2020 report is not that. The 2020 report will include updates only, specifically updates to the budget, which Dan will walk through with you in a moment, and also updates to the data points, the tables, and the recommendations. Specifically, we will address each recommendation that we included in the 2020 report and advise the readers of the legislature of the progress that we've made on the recommendations and how those recommendations have evolved. So to break this down, today, Dan will give you a budget presentation that's happening next. In May, I will be giving you a presentation during the May meeting about the recommendations and an update on each recommendation. And from that, we will then, and by we, I mean Dan and I and our support team, will draft a report to be presented to this committee likely in June. We'll be drafting that likely by June for the review and feedback of this committee in late July, early August 2022. As you probably remember from last time, the report does have to undergo multiple levels of review, specifically internally by the Commissioner's Office, by our accessibility team. So we want to have a final draft to Commissioner Feek by early September, so that it allows enough time for that publication date of 10/31/22. So really, the expectation that I'm hoping that you derive from this is that we're going to be giving you the information in pieces, the updated information in pieces at this meeting, at the next meeting, and then we will be presenting the committee with a draft to review and provide comment and feedback on. Are there any questions about the plan for the report or the committee's role in reviewing the report? Okay, with that, on a related, obviously going right into a related note, Dan, I turn it over to you for the budget.
All right, thank you, Bertha. What I thought I'd do today is walk through, again, the budget requirement, which you can see here for the report, and then the key pieces, namely funding information, related to the federal and state funding we get in this space and how it has changed or not changed since we wrote the report. To take any questions along the way, and then at the end, hear any feedback, thoughts on what we, more information that might be needed, or what we might want to make sure that we include in the report for this year. So again, as you can see on the screen, a reminder of what the requirement for this piece of the report is. It is to number one, provide a breakdown of the costs incurred by the ASWS office to administer the H2A program. Number two, funds to administer other department programs for farm workers. And given how our funding works, as you all know, this kind of meshes in with number three, which is to provide the amount of funds allocated by the federal government to administer the H2A program and all other agriculture programs within the department. Next slide, please. As a reminder, what you can see on the screen now are the three pieces of federal funding that are relevant to this report and our work. As you all know, we receive annually a foreign labor certification grant. And I should say on all of these, we'll from here get into the amount of funding we've been receiving. As you know, this grant, and this is language pulled from our last report, funds services provided by state agencies that support the administration of the H2A and H2B FLC programs. Number two, we get a Wagner-Peiser grant on a annual basis. These are funds that are provided for our employment offices, which we call WorkSource here. And these funds are used to provide universal access to an array of employment and training services, which are available to any job seeker regardless of employment status. So services we provide anybody who walks into or virtually or otherwise connects with our WorkSource office. Then, as you'll recall, of that Wagner-Peiser grant, 10% in Washington is allocated to agriculture work, the agriculture sector, namely to fund migrant seasonal farm worker staff and the state monitor advocate. And again, as we go through this presentation, you'll see charts that'll look familiar from our last report, updated to show what's occurred since we wrote that report in terms of levels of funding received. Next slide, please. So those were the federal funding sources. State funding sources, again, as we all know, the state has allocated funding for the ASWS office, and the duties as prescribed in the bill of this office include processing and adjudicating FLC applications, processing complaints, conducting field checks and field visits, administering the discontinuation and reinstatement of services, and conducting training and outreach activities to employers. We've talked, and as we covered in the report in 2020, there is an Employment Services Administrative Account, or what we call the Claimant Placement Program, or CPP for shorthand. This is funded by a percentage of employer UI taxes and is used when federal funding is insufficient. So we use this fund to supplement federal money that we get for our UI administration, which is inadequate. We use this funding to supplement the Wagner-Peiser grant, which is inadequate to provide the services described on the last slide. And this is the funding source for the ASWS office at this time. Along with CPP, we noted in the last report penalties and interest that employers pay. Some of that is used to cover the cost of the Agriculture Wage and Employment Practices Survey, which is funded through a combination of really all these sources that I laid out here. Next slide, please, and then I'll stop to see if there are any questions. You'll recall we had this chart in our last report. It remains unchanged. So what this chart shows is those sources I just mentioned, and with a check underneath them, if we are using those funds for the activity, you can see on the left-hand side of the chart, an asterisk if we're not but could use those funding sources for those activities, and then blank space where we're not using those funds. So for example, our foreign labor certification grant, we use that funding to review and process H-2A employer applications, coordinate housing inspections. We are allowed and do use 20% of the funding for the survey, and we could also use it, but have not yet, for outreach and training. 20% of those funds can also go to field visits and field checks. We've not used it for those purposes. And you can see domestic recruitment, employment service complaints, discontinuation of services. Those are funded elsewhere, namely by the Wagner-Peiser grant and our ASWS money. Other state funding, again, you can see on the far right side a check. If you go across for the survey, as I mentioned, combination of the FLC grant, Wagner-Peiser, ASWS funding, and other state funding are used for that. Let me stop there before we get into some of the numbers and see if anyone has any questions. Again, this is all language and a chart that we used in the last report, and essentially status quo in terms of what our funding sources are and how we're using them at this point. Any questions so far?
I have a question that's kind of, I don't know if it's off tangent, but I'm just wondering if, to think about this new proposed rule, is that going to have an impact on the dollars coming in from the feds?
It wouldn't, but that is a good point. The rule itself would not. That is a good point. When we would think, typically as we look at a rule, we do contemplate and comment to the Department of Labor, if appropriate, whether or not there'll be a cost to it. So a rule that is asking our agency to do something, if there's a cost to it, we would note it in our comment. So we haven't done enough of a dive for me to answer that question, Rosalinda, but it's a good one, and we'll bring that to the next meeting when we do a deeper dive on that rule. You know, rules do get published where there is a cost associated with it, and then, you know, it's ultimately up to when it comes to federal funding, the U.S. Congress to determine levels of funding for agencies for the various activities they're required to do.
Great, thank you.
All right, next slide, please. All right, so this is a breakdown, one of perhaps two that were in the last report that breaks down how the money allocated to the ASWS office is spent. So as you recall, we had the bill passed in 2019. There was a fiscal note tied to it laying out our estimates of the cost to carry out the various duties in the bill. And as you'll recall, as we approached this last or now current biennium, we essentially asked for the status quo. And as this committee knows, we have very excitedly finally fully staffed up. And so this money is on a state fiscal year timeline. So runs from July 1st to June 30th any given year. So our annual allocation is half of those bold numbers that you see. And our view is that now that we're fully staffed, this upcoming state fiscal year, July 1st through June 30th, we will be able to get a good sense of how our approach is working, what the impacts are, what the resource needs are, and be able to evaluate whether or not this is the way we can best and should best spend our money on these activities. Tamara, I can't remember if there's another ASWS office slide before I take questions. Can you go to the next slide? Okay, so if you can go back and then we'll get to foreign labor certification. I want to see if there are any questions about the ASWS office costs or things that this committee would like to see us break down further or think about as we're engaging in this work in the coming state fiscal year.
And this is John. I noticed that you have the same numbers plugged in for 23-25 biennium as for the current biennium. Is that just a placeholder, or do you think you'd be able to continue current operations within the same dollar amounts? I would imagine that would be difficult, especially for salaries and benefits, but I also know that you incurred a lot of overtime before you were fully staffed up, so that is potentially true.
Yeah, that's a good question, John. And another thing that we'll want to come back to the committee on is it is in a sense a placeholder, but there's also a question of whether we need to go back to the legislature with a decision package again, or how the request for the next year might work. But it is essentially a placeholder, and you're right, there could be adjustments. And again, when you look at this, some of, when I speak to, we need to see how things play out in terms of funding. You can look at the travel line item, for example. We'll see how that plays out now that we're fully staffed. How many field visits are we actually traveling out to? How many placements and field checks are there? So, but to your question, it is a placeholder at this point, but the 2021 through 2023 number is the number that we're funded at.
Might be helpful then if at some point we could review budgeted versus actuals to get a sense of how close you are to maxing out the spending in those categories, and to see how much room there is either for reallocation where savings are occurring, or where you are going to run up against constraints on activity because of lack of budget authority to do certain things.
Agreed. And again, this is an area where the timing of the report is a little tricky because again, I think we need some time to assess our needs now that we're fully staffed and engaging fully in the duties assigned. But your point is taken as an action item. Any other questions or comments on this slide? Okay, next slide, please. All right, so as you'll see as we go through this presentation, this is one area where we have seen an increase, and that is the Foreign Labor Certification Grant. I'll note that our years can get confusing pretty quickly because there's the state fiscal year, there's the federal program year on certain grants, and there's the federal fiscal year on certain grants. And I believe this one's operating on the federal fiscal year. So we saw an increase of $172,579 $1,000 from 400,000 to that number between 20 and 21, which is the current year. And I know that folks on this call have advocated for that funding. We at the department have advocated for increased funding here, and we're starting to see some of that work pay off. We should in the near future, and certainly in enough time for the report, get our 2022 allocation as well. And generally speaking, these funds are very much being used for the processing of FLC, of H2A, namely applications, H2A and H2B applications. As Bertha has briefed the committee, with Tamara moving over to a FLC coordinator spot, we have 3 full-time folks now doing that work. We're thinking through using some of this funding for some supplemental help within our agency for when we hit peak season. The staff find themselves working overtime or against some pretty strict deadlines from the Department of Labor to get applications processed. So this funding is still very much being used for that work primarily, but a little bit beyond that. So I think what we'll want to do here, and what we will do, is provide for the committee a breakdown of how this money is being spent and how we're proposing to spend it in the next year once we have our allocation. Any questions on that? Okay, next slide, please. All right, so Wagner-Pfizer grant. So this one is on a federal program year. So we'll receive or the 2022 program year, as you can see, is to be determined. That program year starts July 1. So we expect to get that application at that allotment at some time in the near future. But as you can see, that funding is essentially status quo from when we last did our report, even down slightly. The Department of Labor determines this amount of funding by a little bit more complicated than this, but by and large, by looking at a state's percentage of the labor force and the total unemployment rate. So in this space, our expectation is status quo. And status quo going forward until we see, or unless we see larger federal appropriations from Congress. Let me go to break down the next couple slides with the 10% and then take any questions folks have. Next slide, please. All right, so as a reminder, we then take 10% of those funds and allocate that specifically to agriculture work. So this is the thrust of that amount. Again, we've got our state monitor advocate, Renee Maldonado, who's funded with this allocation. And then we have outreach staff, MSFWs in all the workforce offices that are deemed agriculturally significant. And I will note in that rule that Gary mentioned earlier, I believe there's some proposed changes in this space that we'll want to put a careful eye on. But you can see the totals there in our report last year. I think it was slightly higher, maybe 1.2 million. And this is what you're looking at is lower than 10% of the overall allotment. But as you recall, there are some other pieces that are funded that aren't included in this chart from our last report. And that those pieces are things like policy work, communications work, IT work, and other administrative work that occurs in this space. Next slide, please. All right, actually, let's go back then. We're about through here. So any questions about Wagner-Pfizer funding? All right, so in short, what we're saying when it comes to federal funding is we're in a very status quo situation from when we wrote the last report. The exception being that we have seen some, and given the size of the grant, a notable increase in our FLC grant. And we'll share with the committee a breakdown of how we're spending that money and maybe more notably how we're intending to spend the money in the next allocation that we should be getting shortly. And then this last slide is simply a reminder about one of the report recommendations that we had. If you could go to the next slide, Tamara. So you'll remember the recommendation in this space was for us to examine the allocation of the funding sources for H2A administrative functions and identify gaps in funding and needed resources to address those gaps if they exist. And you'll recall, and if Juan is still on, maybe he can speak to this. We put in place a process to track those charging that's occurring. And our goal here, or our intent here, would be to bring those results to the committee either in the next meeting or include them when we share the draft report in June, so that you all can see what we found in that charging tracking. And I don't know if Alberto or Juan are still on or are on and have any commentary or anything to add there.
Good morning, team. This is Juan Martinez, the program operator for Wagner Pizer and MSFW. And so we did begin the tracking of H2A related functions that were occurring in the employment connections of the work source centers statewide. So we'd have a better understanding of how much we were spending on H2A related costs at the work source center. So we'll have more budget information available to you for this next report. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Juan. I'll capture this and then open it up for any questions, comments, or thoughts on proceeding. But essentially what we have here is a sort of status quo level of funding. To John's request, we will provide the committee and potentially include in the report a comparison of budgeted versus actuals for the ASWS office. And we will be noting that the office is now fully staffed and will be assessing its needs in the coming state fiscal year. And also we'll be coming back to the committee with a more detailed breakdown of how we spend our FLC money and how we intend to spend our FLC money when we get our next grant application. Our grant allocation. So I will stop there and see if we have any either questions, clarifications, comments, or suggestions on additional information or things to think about for this year's report. And I'll note you all have this slide deck, and if anything comes to mind after the meeting, we're of course happy to take any input offline as well.
And this is John. When we go revisit some of the Wagner Pizer expenses, I think it would be helpful to have some context for how much volume and what the trends are in non-agricultural, both workers seeking employment and employers seeking workers. So that if we're asking the worksource staff to do more in the agricultural workspace, is that in competition with other sectors, or have they seen diminished activity as or are they seeing pressures on their time across multiple sectors? I think having that comparison would be helpful.
Yeah, I appreciate that, John, and we can take a look at doing that. And that reminded me, one thing to note about that Wagner Pizer funding is due to the UI crisis in this period since our last report, or since the beginning of 2020, we shifted a notable number of staff from employment services to unemployment insurance services. And that staff, of course, charged their time to the UI administration grant. We had periods where WorkSource was closed down, then we had virtual service, and now we're back and open. And so because that occurred, we had less charging to Wagner Pizer than we had anticipated. However, as you'll recall from earlier in the conversation, that funding is supplemented by CPP. So the impact of that was essentially less reliance on CPP and then carryover funding from the Wagner Pizer grant, and ultimately we're getting back to, or are back to, sort of status quo or pre-pandemic levels of work source staffing and charging to that grant. Right, so additional item from John I'm hearing is a sort of examination of agriculture versus other employment services spending or activity. Any other questions, comments, or thoughts on the budget?
Thank you, Dan. I'm really looking forward to that more detailed report that Juan talked about.
All right. So again, happy to take any further questions you have offline. Otherwise, we'll be back with more information, and ultimately, as Bertha suggested, that section of the report in June. All right. For the next piece of our agenda, our next advisory committee meeting is scheduled for May 19th. And at that meeting, We've got a couple things that we'll certainly have on the agenda, or I should say, our beginning of our first agenda items will remain constant: approval of the meeting minutes and ASWS office updates from Bertha and her team. We'll have a discussion around the proposed rule that Gary mentioned earlier, and then we'll also walk through where we are with all of the recommendations from the 2020 report to set the table for, as Bertha laid out, a draft of the report some point in June. We will follow up and determine next steps on adverse weather impacts. And that may be another agenda item. It may be we have a subgroup working on that. We'll leave that as to be determined. Are there other topics that advisory committee members would like to see on the agenda for our May 19th meeting?
And I was distracted for a minute here. Did you mention a follow-up on the freeze, on the weather incident?
Yes. So our intent there, Rosalinda, is to think a bit on how to approach that. We do have the data request, so we'll have that. Think about how to approach that, potentially engage a subgroup on that topic, and potentially bring that back as a continued conversation to have in May.
All right, thank you.
Dan, Mike Empler, I don't know if this is included in the regular reporting, but I would like to know what kind of activity there is at the different work source offices regarding inquiries about agricultural work, not just referrals to H2A, but in general, the amount of business that they get regarding agricultural placements.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit, Mike?
I'd like to know how many people are looking for farm jobs. Through WorkSource.
Got it. So like a broader look at what sort of agriculture activities, job search activities, and otherwise are occurring in the space in our WorkSource offices.
Yeah.
Juan, do you have any comments on that or thoughts on that?
Yeah, that would be something we'd have to take a look at. That might be a tricky one to delineate what type of work individuals are looking for. But we'll definitely make an attempt to see if we can't provide something. Gustavo, anything on the labor market trends that might be able to help us with this?
Hello, everyone. This is Gustavo. I don't think so, Juan. Just on top of my head, I can think that we track that information, but I'll look into it as well.
Thank you, Gustavo.
And Gustavo, it may be worth just putting in the chat the dashboard that you have, just to remind committee members that is out there, and we'll review that issue and come back to the committee. Other topics of conversation for the next meeting? All right, hearing none, we're ready to open for public comment. Not sure, is there an interpreter on the line?
Abraham, I'm your Spanish interpreter.
Oh, Abraham, welcome. Thank you for joining us. And so I will just make a statement here, opening the floor for public comment. I'll speak slowly and pause so that you can jump in with a translation. If you would like to make public comment, please state your name and spell it.
Si les gustaría hacer un comentario público, por favor, digan su nombre y deletréenlo.
That way we can capture it correctly for the minutes.
Así podemos capturar su nombre correctamente para los minutos.
Please also state the organization you represent, if any.
Por favor, también nombren la organización la que representan en caso de que haya alguna.
Your comments are being recorded.
Sus comentarios serán grabados.
However, if you would like your comments to be included in the meeting minutes,
Sin embargo, si gustarían que sus minutos sean incluidos dentro de los minutos de la junta,
please submit them in writing via email
por favor, hacerlo saber por escrito vía correo electrónico
to Vicky Carlson.
a Vicky Carlson.
Her email is in the chat.
Su correo electrónico lo pueden encontrar en el chat de esta llamada.
And it is VICKIE
Se escribe VICKY
.CARLSON
CARLSON
at esd.wa.gov.
@esd.wa.gov.
Please limit your comments to 2 minutes.
Por favor, limiten sus comentarios a 2 minutos.
Do we have any public comment?
¿Tenemos algún comentario público?
Okay, I see and hear no public comment.
Veo que no hay comentario público.
All right, our next committee meeting will occur from 8:30 to 11:30 via Zoom on Thursday, May 19th. We look forward to working with you all between now and then and seeing you at that meeting. Thank you very much. We're adjourned.